thought was really interesting about this video is because I think that there's always like a distinction, because I do teach languages, like that's something I can do, but I don't really consider myself a teacher. It's more of just like I'm a private tutor. And honestly, sometimes it's a privilege to have a private tutor, because sometimes, most of the time they're not cheap and they're teaching one person. A lot of people do get tutors because I think that maybe their kids might want to have more personalized attention, because I do teach a couple of girls who are homeschooled because their parent just basically believes that, they just have more individualized learning. And I honestly recommend it, because I think that when you're teaching, like when you are an actual teacher, teaching, like kids, a bunch of kids as a whole, as like a whole classroom, it can be a little bit different to make sure that every single person gets it. And then you're also dealing with different needs. It's more, I feel like, to me personally, I enjoy personalized tutoring, because I think that I love giving people personal attention, because I like personal attention, that's my thing. And so I just have a couple of things I really wanted to go over in terms of what that really looks like for me and how I prep for my students, because I think it's one thing to teach, but there's a lot of things that go on to that, especially because with my rate, as of right now, is 55 per hour, 55 US dollars per hour. And it kind of grew over time because of the quality of what I had to put into it. So it's not just like you just show up and you just teach a language. There's a lot of different things that go into it. So the first thing I really wanted to talk about is how I reach my specialty, because I think it's so easy to say I teach this language and you think that there's a lot of that's just it. Like you can know French really well, but it also has to do with like finding out how you're able to teach, like what kinds of people. So for me, I chose my specialty with absolute beginners, like beginners with some prior knowledge, and absolute beginners who just don't know anything, because I felt like that's an easier place for me to start. Because I think that for me, as a person who is still an advanced learner, I am quite proficient, but there's still a lot of things that I would, that I am learning every day, because I'm still immersed in the content and content as well, just so that I can at least keep my vocabulary up to date, because the language is changing all the time. Because I like the idea of a foundation. I think that everyone needs a really good building block as to how they're going to move forward with that language. I think that with beginners, like you also want to come in with like, I love when they come in with a complete clean slate, because it's like, okay, there's no mistakes. I can tell you everything that I think that you need to know. And I have a whole, like a step-by-step guide as to how I want to go about that. And it's usually based on what a student really, how they learn, what their experience is, what they need. I do a whole consultation, which I will talk about that as well. So I kind of arrived at beginners because I'm also a non-native speaker. And so because I'm a non-native speaker, I'm going to have a different perspective on that language, for example, French, than I would with English, like as a native English speaker. Because I think that when you have someone who's a native speaker, yes, they can speak that language. And I think native speakers are great with advanced students, not for beginners. It's like I think native speakers are great for advanced, because at that point, it's like you have a foundation. They don't have to explain how the language works. Because a lot of times, even for me as a native English speaker, I don't sometimes know how to explain my own language. I don't know how to explain or kind of break that down. When you're a non-native speaker, it's like you're taking this foreign language and you're kind of figuring it out and creating formulas to simplify it for beginners. And that's actually something I'm good at. And I'm also really good at explaining things in details and how things work and analyzing things. So that kind of was where I went. And so part of it also, when I was looking into linguistics, is I fell into the branch of psycholinguistics, because I was really fascinated with how our brains are able to adapt to language, like first and second language acquisition, which I did a whole video on my perspective on that. And it can overlap with applied linguistics, because applied linguistics has a lot to do with like how language can be taught, like in education, language in education. Psycholinguistics is more of just like looking at how do we think, how do we process language. And I think that does play a part in how I teach, because even though they kind of overlap, because I can both of those are kind of like, I can go either way. And I've kind of dabbled a little bit in sociolinguistics, because I know that I like being able to look at different dialects and different ways that people speak that language. like, for example, French, there are multiple countries that speak it. So I'm always fascinated, especially when I have students that have, they learn it for reasons like, I have a spouse in another country, I have these types of things, they have all these different kind of reasons as to why they want to learn a certain dialect. Because I had a student at one point, her family was from Cameroon. So she had some family in the US and Cameroon, and she was going back and forth, and she just wanted to have a basic understanding. And so that's kind of how I arrived in that. And I think that also really affects my teaching, because I understand that people don't think the same, which is why I think that it's really important to look at the aspect, because I really pay attention to how my students are processing. Because a lot of times I'll ask them, okay, so you read this. What do you think that this is saying? And I love to hear their answers. I always hate it when they say, oh, I don't know. And they just brush it off. And I'm like, yes, you know something. You have an idea. I don't care if it's wrong. I just want to know where your mind is so I can kind of correct it. Or, if it is in the right direction, then it's like, yeah, yay. You got it. So I just like to know how people think, in terms of when they answer the questions that I have, or when I speak in French and I'm like, okay, how would you respond to what I just said? I like to be able to see how they process it. And that's a really big part of my teaching. And also how I kind of wanted to work more with beginners. So that's kind of like a long story short. It was more so as I chose my specialty because I'm good at analyzing things and creating simplified formulas. I'm very good at explaining it in a way to where it feels like almost an idiot can understand it. So the other thing about it is, like, with working with my students, is I treat them like a doctor would treat their patients, because, again, like I said, this is a different mindset. Like I said, with a teacher, you have a certain guideline of content you're supposed to teach, and your job is just to generally figure out how to get all these students to learn it. From my perspective, it's more of like a diagnosis and a consultation. So I will kind of show you what that looks like. I do, usually when I meet a student for the first time, I do set up a chart for them, and I'm actually going to show you that in a little bit. I do set up a chart for them. I do ask questions. I need to know what their experience with the language is, because I need to know where to start. I'm not going to start with the alphabet if you've been taking French in high school at one point and you kind of have a basic understanding. I don't need to go over certain pronunciation aspects. Like what their experience is like in terms of using it. Okay, like if a student has traveled a lot, like I've had some students who just love to travel. Like, okay, so how has your experience been when in the past when you've traveled to those countries, and you've had to, like, what was your, like, were you struggling with, I don't know, like speaking, understanding native speakers, which I understand listening comprehension is sometimes very difficult, especially because I can teach it, but then it's like I tried my best to make sure that like they're exposed to how native speakers communicate, because I know that they don't always communicate in a way that like they speak really fast, they eat letters, like I'm going to do something versus I'm gonna do something. We drop off letters, we eat words, and it's really confusing. So that's like my experience is like when I talk to my students, what has your experience been like traveling to those countries? Do you have any relationships or anybody that you know of that speaks that language natively? Or one of the things I will ask is like, what do they want? Why do you even want to learn this language in the first place? Because I think if people, and I've seen a lot of students who I will see them in the first lesson and then I'll never see them again. I always ask, why do you want to learn this language? Because it kind of gives me a direction of what kind of content I'm going to teach, but then it also tells me, how motivated is this person? Because I always tell people, I'm straight up, I don't BS anybody. It's about a good 3 months to be conversational, just for a beginner to go from zero to being able to have a basic conversation, just to be able to talk about themselves, to be able to like ask for information, like, just basic, like beginner, like A1 level stuff, we might not get into like the whole aspect of talking about like, I don't know, like being on the phone and, like organizing, I don't know, like making doctor's appointments and that. It's just basically it's just having a basic conversation. From my observations, because I have had students who have been with me for 6+ months, some even longer. So with that being the case, is that I think that it's really important for me. It's really important to kind of get as much information about them, and I take notes on detailed notes on those. So, and I will show you how that works. So for the first part is, so I have a whole Google Drive specifically with student files. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a whole new file just for this sake. So for every student, I actually have a file that's called student progress charts. So I just usually keep those for templates of like what I usually will do, like a learning plan, inquiry specifically if I want them to fill something out. I don't do that as much because I just take care of that in the consultation. But yeah, so I'm gonna create a separate file. So when I have a new student, let's say new student, usually when I go in there, before going there, I create a copy, and then I usually will just take that copy and I'll just move that to whatever that file is that I just made. So new students, I usually have a progress chart that I have from someone who I've taught before. So when I'm in here, this is new student. So usually I have their name at the top. I sometimes don't really put their last name unless I really know who they are, because sometimes on Preply they will give your first name and then a last initial. So I don't always know what their last name is, but their first name is always there. And I put their name, title of the document, their name, and then student progress. I usually record the date that I saw them, what I went over and whatnot, and any observations. I have observations over here, and then I have goals for next time. So like I might put something in there, let's say if we're meeting today, 3/8, or the 8th of March, then I will say I reviewed their we'll review grammatical structure, because let's say I'll put like a note in there like to say they struggled with, the pronunciation was great and they struggled with forming sentences. I should probably autocorrect that. Goal for next time, what are we going to do next time? And then I kind of go from there. And then when I get in to do my student prep, I usually will go back and look at what their goals were, and then I will put that in. And when I start thinking about what I want them to do in that next lesson, and then so when I get to my student prep, I'm basically looking at the lesson notes from the last lesson versus just looking at what I think they should go over. I put the initial consultation notes down here, like at the bottom of the chart, and because I really don't look at it unless like it's like the second lesson. So I use the first lesson. That's usually when I'm doing these notes, but then usually afterwards I never look at them again, because at that point I'm getting to know my students based on the fact that I'm seeing them as often as I am. I might go over certain content, and a lot of times, like, since I mentioned I do create my own content in Canva, because I don't like to deal with copyright and stuff like that and paying for other people's content when I can make it myself. So that's part of why what my rate is I do create my own content. And a lot of times I'm not even using my content. Like that's usually when it's something specific, like foundational stuff. But when I'm working with them individually on their skill sets, I actually don't do that. I actually don't use them. So it's like, if it's something that I know that is universal that everyone needs to know, like basics, like definite, indefinite articles or things like that, I do have material for that. But normally I just use a good old fashioned Google Doc. So when I know that I'm going to do something that involves them being active, I usually will create a document. So I will put, like, let's say today is the 8th. And so there's a lot of things I can really do with this. So usually what I'll do is I'll put this as like a title. I have a specific format for this. Usually it'll go from, like, let's say I might do some starter questions, like maybe a couple of questions that I want them to kind of learn how to answer. But I think based on whatever it is that they know that they're going to use the language for. That's why understanding why they're learning this language really helps. Sometimes what I'll do is I might take an article from somewhere. I might take like a paragraph or two, and it's usually something that's written by a native speaker, which is what VPNs are for, which I have a whole video on how you can use that as a language learning tool. So please check that out. So I might have that in there, and I might do like a reading activity. What I'll also do is I'll put like source, and I have let's say I got it from France 24, which is a news company, like news broadcasting company. So I might put that in there, and then I'll hyperlink, Control K. I'll put like where I got that from, and I put the link in there. Okay. And then usually we just go line by line. I get them to read, check their pronunciation, check how they understood what they read, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes if we do conversation practice, I usually just take a Google Doc and we're just going to have a back and forth conversation going over certain verbs or something like that. And I'll just basically, I will just give them anything that they don't know. Like we'll have a back and forth conversation. And then I'll put down, like, if they get stuck on something, I might say, oh, like what you meant to say was, like, let's say the verb faire, which is to do or to make. I might say, like, if they don't know how to use that in a certain conjugation, I might write it out for them, like je fais, like I'm doing something or making something. So in that case, like if they need a written guidance, we're going to have a conversation, but I'm also writing and having them kind of understand what's going on, especially if I say something they don't know that's outside of their vocabulary. I can kind of do that. Other thing I always do is, like, when I have students where I'm teaching them specific concepts, but more in a review style, sometimes what I might do is I might just have like lesson notes, and it's like I'll make like a little chart. Like if they don't understand, let's say, like if I'm teaching someone on like how to conjugate certain verbs. I mean, even though I have content, like I have presentational slides and notes on that, but like if I'm spelling it out for them, I might say, like, this is the conditional tense or something, like present tense. And I might show them like subject, pronouns, and then conjugation in the conditional. So whatever the verb is, and then what it means in the definition. So it's kind of like, and then I'll kind of write those out for them. And I usually, what I'll do is if I have to do it multiple times, like if I'm showing them different verbs, I literally just sometimes just copy the chart, and then I usually will just copy the chart and I'll write it out for them. I'll write it out for them again, and I'll just like delete all the stuff that I put in there, and then I'll say, okay, now this is, let's say, like if I'm talking about the conditional past, then I'll delete all that information and then put that in there. So that way, like I still can give them, and I save the notes and I give them to them at the end of the lesson, so they at least can grasp what we talked about. Sometimes they might prefer it as a PDF. Sometimes they prefer it as a Word document, so they can add their own notes and things like that. So it's up to them. They can I never really give them to them unless they ask for them, because I know that like some people they're like, I just know that they're not going to look at it and something like that. And then also what I will also say is I spend a lot of time online. So for like the most part, like I learned so much on YouTube, because that's how I've learned most of my languages. Because on YouTube, you actually find things. Like that's why a VPN is necessary. I'll be honest with you. I am not sponsored. This video is not sponsored, but I will just say that a VPN is very, very helpful if you are learning a language or if you're trying to find content as a teacher. So I usually will find, like, for example, learn Italian with Lucrezia. Like for Italian, I might find like all these types of videos for language learning. I really constantly find sources that teach the language in the language. Like I have like ASMR channels for like, I have like one for Arabic. I have some that teach the language in the language, like Easy Arabic, Easy French, Easy Spanish. Feli from Germany, yoga and fitness. She does that online. So I usually will find like things. This is how I find things to recommend for students, like for homework. And I'm like, hey, look, I know you love doing this, so I found you someone who is a native speaker who does this. Sometimes I look at news sources or like media. I do love Brut. So Brut is like, it's actually funny because it's like sparkling, like if you're looking for like a sparkling wine, that's like a Brut. Have you ever heard of that term? So I look at find things that I think would be really cool or interesting, news-wise or just pop culture-wise, and podcasts, or even like one of my favorites right now is Speaking Brazilian with Virginia, and so she teaches Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese in Portuguese, and it's very, very effective. I've done so many of her videos, and so I always recommend those. Sometimes I find things like Lollywood, which is actually, I highly recommend this if you are a French learner, because even though it's like it's kind of advanced, but it's like they do comedy sketches. They're actually on TF1, which is a major broadcasting network for like entertainment and stuff like that. So I watch a lot of their videos because they're really fun, and even if you don't understand, it's pretty easy to follow what's going on. So I always try to find foreign content to get my students used to seeing this content and hearing it, so that like my goal is like as a person who specializes in beginners, my goal is to get them to transition from basics and prepare them for native speakers. So once they're prepared for native speakers, then they're out of my hands at that point. And then I release them into the wild. And then I also want to talk about like scheduling. So in my calendar, I do time block for when I put my, not necessarily my Google calendar, but I do in my paper calendar. So at this point, I usually have highlighted all of the highlighted parts are usually when they're really, really important, like when I'm teaching, because my Google calendar just tells me where I need to be. My paper calendar gives me all of my tasks. So usually like on Mondays, I usually will do that, especially after work. So like Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Sometimes I might have students who, let's say, they're going to be gone for a while. Like I know that one of my students, I was teaching her 2 days a week, and now she's going to be gone for 3 weeks. So like that's 3 weeks where I'm going to actually spend more time looking at any course material that I might need to create. And I try to make them fun, like, like pop quizzes and things like that. And Canva has a lot of templates, so I just kind of adapt. I just alter them towards what I want to teach. So homework. Usually when I give students homework, it is always optional. And the reason for that is because I know that everyone has busy lives, and them having me as a teacher is just more so as just, or as a tutor, is more of like something that they've kind of added on. A lot of people, because they've invested money into this, because a lot of people actually pay for multiple lessons up front. So because of that, I know for a fact that I do need to make sure that, if there's anything that I feel like I need to work on, because that's also part of their chart, I'll give them like some videos that I think they're really interesting to watch that are very informative, or as a review. I might give them resources. I'm like, this might be helpful for you, just so you can kind of get active into that language, so that the next time I see you, some students, they take more initiative than others. So it really depends. Some people, they'll look at it, and then other people, they may just be like, thanks, I'll store it away, so it really depends. And sometimes I have students where they can't make it. So like I have a 24-hour cancellation policy. So if something comes up and they can't cancel, or they can't make it, then what I do is I'll usually either record a lesson for them and send it to them, so it just feels like they still have a lesson. It's just that they can watch it at their convenience. Or what I'll do is I'll send them some additional resources or things that I would have worked on with them, just so I can accommodate that. Overall, I really think it's important to establish a personal relationship, because I realize some of them, I actually, like when I teach them and they leave, I'm like, well, what are you guys doing with this language? So a lot of times I get students who, I get their WhatsApp numbers, or I get their email. One of them, I actually got her Instagram, and it's just sharing like what they're doing. Like if you're needing a private tutor for your trip to France, wherever you're going, I want to see, actually, honestly, as a tutor, or just as a teacher in general, is that, you kind of want to see where they end up. Like, how did you use that? And then I stay connected. I always ask for them to do like a review, maybe after they've had me for like maybe about a month and a half or so, just so that they're able to have a full perspective of what my teaching looks like. I never ask for anyone to do a review unless I feel like they have been with me for quite a while. I want them to obviously be honest, but it's like after a month and a half of consistently, at least on a weekly basis, been taking lessons with me, I will ask for a review, especially if I'm seeing progress. So it's not required, but I just kind of want to know what you felt like was important. And I always ask for feedback all the time, because I think that you should always want to improve. Improvement is great. I do try to think of ideas of what I'm going to do when I'm doing my student prep, because I'm like, what would be great for this? Like, I'm teaching kids on Saturdays. So I was thinking like, well, they wanted to do numbers. I'm like, well, you know what? Let's do a recipe. Like, I will find a random recipe, and I will just do it. And sometimes teaching them all virtually, because they're in another state. I don't know where they are, but basically they're in another state. And so I'm teaching them online. And so I'm like, okay, let's do a recipe. So I'll have like all these images and things like that. And it's been very versatile. Even though I teach beginners, I think I've been more successful teaching adults because they I can kind of explain how that works. I have taught 4-year-old triplets some English, and it was just kind of like, it's a different mindset. So you kind of have to adapt, because the thing at the end of the day, I do teach beginners, but I do know that everyone is different. And so I kind of like to have that kind of expansive range of like age-wise. So it's really fun. So I really hope this helps you, and I hope that if you're a teacher or anyone, if you feel like this might help you with your prep. I know that I'm a private tutor. So again, I'm more individualized. I only have to cater to one particular person at a time. So I love it because I can build a relationship. I can monitor their progress. I can see where their mindset's at, like being able to celebrate their individual progress. So anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.